Imagine a king so ruthless that even his closest friends feared him. He toppled the greatest empire on earth. He marched his armies to the edge of the known world and wept when there was nowhere left to go. And yet history remembers him as a hero. This is Alexander the Great, the conqueror whose ambition changed the world forever. But before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way to this tale of conquest. Now let us journey back to the ancient world to discover how one man's ruthless ambition shaped civilization. The story of Alexander begins not with the man himself, but with the wild and rugged kingdom that forged him. In the northern reaches of the Greek world lay a land called Macedon. To the cultured citizens of Athens and Sparta, the Macedonians were barely Greek at all. They were seen as rough and uncivilized mountain people. They spoke a strange dialect. They lived in a kingdom ruled by kings, while the southern Greeks prided themselves on their democracies and city-states. The land itself was harsh. It was a place of thick forests, rocky mountains, and cold winters. The people who lived there were tough and warlike. They had to be. They were surrounded by hostile tribes who constantly raided their borders. For generations, Macedon was a minor power, often forced to pay tribute to stronger neighbours just to survive. But everything changed with the rise of one exceptional man. His name was Philip II, and he was Alexander's father. Philip came to power in 359 BC, when the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. Enemy armies were invading from all sides. The royal treasury was empty. The army was weak and poorly organised. Lesser men would have despaired. Philip saw only opportunity. He was a man of extraordinary cunning and ambition. He'd spent years as a hostage in the Greek city of Thebes, where he had studied the most advanced military tactics of the age. He learned everything he could about how the Greeks fought their wars, and he returned to Macedon with a plan to make his kingdom the greatest power in the world. Philip's first and greatest achievement was the creation of a new kind of army. The traditional Greek soldier was a hoplite, a heavily armoured infantryman who fought in a dense formation called a phalanx. Philip took this concept and transformed it into something far more deadly. He armed his soldiers with a revolutionary new weapon called the sarissa. This was an enormously long spear, measuring about 18 feet in length. It was so long that a soldier needed both hands to hold it. When the Macedonian phalanx advanced, it presented a wall of deadly spear points that no enemy could approach. The first 5 rows of soldiers could all extend their sarissas at once, creating a bristling hedge of iron that was almost impossible to break. But Philip knew that infantry alone could not win wars. He also built the finest cavalry force in the ancient world. These were the companion cavalry, the elite warriors of Macedon. They were recruited from the sons of the Macedonian nobility. They were trained from childhood to ride and fight. In battle, they served as the hammer, while the infantry phalanx acted as the anvil. The cavalry would smash into the enemy's flank, while the phalanx pinned them in place. This combination of disciplined infantry and shock cavalry was devastating. It was the military system that Philip would pass on to his son, and it would prove unstoppable. Philip did not just build an army, he used it with ruthless efficiency. Over the next 2 decades, he conquered or subdued almost all of Greece through a combination of brilliant military campaigns, clever diplomacy, and outright bribery. He was a master manipulator who knew that gold was often more effective than steel. He famously said that no fortress was impregnable if you could get a donkey laden with gold through its gates. By 338 BC, Philip had achieved what no man had done before. He had united the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership. He was now the most powerful man in the Greek world. But his ambition reached even further. He announced his intention to lead a great Greek crusade against the ancient enemy of all Greeks, the mighty Persian Empire. While Philip was conquering Greece, a boy was growing up in the royal palace of Pella who would surpass all his father's achievements. Alexander was born in 356 BC. From the very beginning, there were signs that he was destined for greatness. Wow. Legend says that on the night of his birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, burned to the ground. The Persian priests interpreted this as an omen that a great destroyer had been born in the West. Whether true or not, the story captures the sense of destiny that surrounded Alexander from his earliest days. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the neighbouring kingdom of Epirus. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer ambition. She was deeply devoted to strange religious cults and was said to sleep with sacred snakes in her bed. Olympias filled her son's head with stories of his divine ancestry. She told him that he was descended from Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. She even hinted that his true father was not Philip at all, but the god Zeus himself, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. These stories had a profound effect on the young Alexander. He grew up believing that he was destined for something extraordinary, that the blood of gods and heroes flowed in his veins. Philip recognized his son's exceptional abilities and gave him the finest education money could buy. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip hired the greatest philosopher in the world to be his tutor. This was Aristotle, one of the most brilliant minds in human history. For 3 years, Alexander studied under Aristotle's guidance in a rural retreat called the Gardens of Midas. He learned philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. He developed a deep love of Greek culture, especially the epic poems of Homer. The Iliad, the story of the Trojan War and the hero Achilles, became Alexander's favourite book. He kept a copy under his pillow for the rest of his life, alongside a dagger. He saw himself as a new Achilles, destined to win eternal glory through warfare. But Alexander was not just a scholar, he was also a natural warrior. At the age of 16, while his father was away on campaign, a Thracian tribe rebelled against Macedonian rule. The young prince led an army against them and crushed the rebellion with startling efficiency. He even founded a new city on the site of his victory and named it Alexandropolis after himself. It was the first sign of his boundless ambition. 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Alexander commanded the companion cavalry on the crucial left wing of the Macedonian army. It was this battle that finally crushed Greek resistance to Macedonian power. The young prince led the decisive charge that shattered the elite sacred band of Thebes. He was just 18 years old, and he had already proven himself one of the finest cavalry commanders in the world. The relationship between Philip and Alexander was complicated and often tense. They were too similar, too ambitious, and too proud to coexist peacefully. Things came to a head when Philip divorced Olympias and married a young Macedonian noblewoman. At the wedding feast, the bride's uncle made a toast expressing hope that the marriage would produce a legitimate heir to the throne. Alexander was furious. He hurled his cup at the man and shouted that he was not a bastard. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son, but was so drunk that he tripped and fell. Alexander looked down at his father with contempt and said, "Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." Alexander and his mother fled the court into exile. Father and son were eventually reconciled, but the damage was done. Their relationship remained poisoned with mutual suspicion. Then, in the summer of 336 BC, everything changed. Philip was attending the wedding of his daughter in the old Macedonian capital of Aegae. As he walked into the theatre for the ceremony, one of his own bodyguards rushed forward and stabbed him through the heart. The king fell dead in an instant. The assassin tried to flee but tripped and was killed by the other guards before he could be questioned. The motive for the murder has never been fully explained. Some suspected it was a personal grudge. Others whispered that Olympias or even Alexander himself had arranged the killing. We will never know the truth. What we do know is that in one bloody moment, Alexander became king of Macedon at the age of 20. The young king's position was far from secure. He was surrounded by enemies who saw an opportunity to strike. The Greek cities that Philip had conquered immediately began to rebel. The barbarian tribes on Macedon's northern borders prepared to invade. Even within the royal court, there were rivals and pretenders who might challenge his claim to the throne. Alexander responded with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned the ancient world. Within days of his father's murder, he had eliminated all potential rivals within Macedon. Some were executed. Others were killed by mysterious accidents. He showed no mercy and no hesitation. This was the first glimpse of the iron will that would carry him to the ends of the earth. Then he turned to face his external enemies. The Greek cities had declared their independence the moment they heard of Philip's death. The great city of Thebes was leading the rebellion. Alexander marched south with his army at incredible speed. The Greeks were still debating what to do when they suddenly found a Macedonian army at their gates. Most cities immediately surrendered, but Thebes refused to submit. Alexander besieged the city and took it by storm. His punishment was terrible and deliberate. He razed the entire city to the ground. Every building was destroyed except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. 30,000 citizens were sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes sent a message that echoed across Greece. This young king was not to be trifled with. The rebellion collapsed. Greece was once again under Macedonian control. With his rear secured, Alexander could finally turn his attention to the great prize that his father had dreamed of conquering. The Persian Empire was the largest and wealthiest empire the world had ever known. It stretched from Egypt in the west to India in the east. It contained dozens of different peoples and cultures, all ruled by the great king from his magnificent palaces at Persepolis and Susa. The current king was Darius III, a tall and handsome man who had recently come to the throne. He commanded armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and treasuries overflowing with gold. On paper, the contest between tiny Macedon and the vast Persian Empire seemed absurdly unequal, but Alexander had the finest army in the world and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He brought with him about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was a tiny force compared to the resources of Persia, but it was superbly trained and absolutely loyal to its young king. As his ship approached the Asian shore, Alexander hurled his spear into the sand, claiming the entire continent as territory won by the spear. He then visited the ruins of Troy, the site of the legendary war that Homer had immortalized. He laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles and took what was said to be the hero's ancient armour to carry into battle. He was deliberately casting himself as a new Achilles, come to finish what the Greeks had started 1,000 years before. The first test came quickly. A Persian army was waiting for him at the Granicus River, not far from the coast. The Persian commanders had gathered a force of cavalry and Greek mercenaries to stop the invasion before it could begin. Alexander did not hesitate. Despite the objections of his generals, who wanted to wait until morning, he ordered an immediate attack across the river. The Macedonian cavalry plunged into the water and charged up the far bank into the waiting Persians. It was a brutal and confused battle. At one point, Alexander himself was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman struck him on the head with a sword, splitting his helmet. Before the Persian could deliver the killing blow, one of Alexander's companions cut off the man's arm with a slash of his sword. The battle turned in favour of the Macedonians. The Persian cavalry broke and fled. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were surrounded and massacred. Alexander had won his first great victory on Asian soil. The victory at the Granicus opened all of Asia Minor to Alexander. The coastal cities, many of them Greek settlements that had been under Persian rule for generations, welcomed him as a liberator. He spent the next year systematically conquering the region, freeing the Greek cities, and installing friendly governments. But he also showed his ruthless side. When the city of Tyre refused to surrender, he besieged it for 7 months before finally taking it by storm. The population was massacred or sold into slavery. When the city of Gaza resisted, Alexander had its governor dragged behind a chariot until he was dead, deliberately imitating Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. He could be a liberator or a destroyer, depending on whether you submitted to him or not. While Alexander was conquering the coast, King Darius was gathering the full might of the Persian Empire. He assembled an enormous army, perhaps 200,000 men, and marched west to crush the invader. The two armies met at a place called Issus in 333 BC. It was the first time Alexander faced the Persian king himself. The battlefield was a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains and the sea. This terrain actually favoured Alexander, as it prevented the Persians from using their superior numbers effectively. When the battle began, Alexander led his companion cavalry in his customary position on the right wing. He spotted Darius himself, standing in a magnificent chariot in the centre of the Persian line. Alexander charged directly at the king, cutting his way through the Persian bodyguard. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in military history. As Alexander approached, Darius panicked. The great king of Persia, master of the largest empire on earth, turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. His army, seeing their king in flight, lost heart and collapsed. The Persian forces were routed. Alexander had won a stunning victory, but he had missed capturing Darius himself by mere minutes. In the Persian camp, he found a treasure beyond imagination. There was gold, jewels, and luxurious furnishings. He also captured Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander treated them with great courtesy and respect. He assured them that Darius was still alive and that they would not be harmed. This chivalrous gesture enhanced his reputation as a noble conqueror. But it also sent a message. He was treating them not as hostages, but as the family of a defeated king. He was claiming Darius's empire for himself. Darius fled east to raise another army. He sent Alexander a message offering peace. He would give up all the lands west of the Euphrates River and pay an enormous ransom for his family. Alexander's general Parmenion reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept the offer. Alexander replied, "So would I if I were Parmenion." He rejected the peace offer contemptuously. He was not interested in half an empire. He wanted it all. But before pursuing Darius, Alexander turned south toward Egypt. The ancient land of the pharaohs was one of the richest and most strategically important provinces of the Persian Empire. When Alexander arrived, the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian oppression. The Persian governor surrendered without a fight. In Egypt, Alexander made a decision that revealed his growing sense of divine destiny. He made a long and dangerous journey across the desert to visit the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis. What exactly happened there remains a mystery. Alexander entered the temple alone and never revealed the full content of the prophecy he received. But when he emerged, he was convinced that the oracle had confirmed his divine parentage. From this point on, he increasingly referred to Zeus Ammon as his father. He began to see himself not just as a great king, but as a living god. This belief would shape his behaviour for the rest of his life. It gave him absolute confidence in his destiny. It also alienated many of his Macedonian followers, who found such divine pretensions deeply offensive. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded a new city at the mouth of the Nile. He named it Alexandria, after himself. It was not the first city he had named after himself, nor would it be the last. He would eventually found more than 20 cities bearing his name across his empire. But this Alexandria would become the greatest of them all. It would grow into one of the largest and most important cities in the ancient world, famous for its lighthouse, its library, and its learning. It would remain a centre of culture and commerce for centuries after Alexander's death. Even today, it is the second largest city in Egypt. Of all Alexander's achievements, the founding of Alexandria may be the most enduring. With Egypt secured, Alexander turned east to seek his final confrontation with Darius. The Persian king had spent the past 2 years gathering the largest army he could assemble. He drew soldiers from every corner of his vast empire. There were cavalry from the Iranian highlands, infantry from Babylon, chariots with scythes attached to their wheels, and even war elephants from India. Ancient sources claim his army numbered over 1 million men. This is certainly an exaggeration, but it was undoubtedly an enormous force, far larger than anything Alexander had faced before. Darius chose his battlefield carefully. He found a wide, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. He even had the ground leveled to give his chariots and cavalry every advantage. The two armies met on the first day of October in 331 BC. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals were terrified. They could see the campfires of the Persian army stretching to the horizon. Parmenion suggested a night attack to catch the Persians off guard. Alexander refused. He would not steal his victory, he said. He would win it in open battle where all could see. That night, while his men worried and prayed, Alexander slept so soundly that his officers had to shake him awake the next morning. When they asked how he could sleep so peacefully before such a battle, he replied that he had already won. The hardest part had been catching Darius. Now that the Persian king had finally stood to fight, the outcome was certain. The Battle of Gaugamela was the largest and most important battle Alexander ever fought. As the sun rose, the two armies faced each other across the dusty plain. The Persians launched their scythed chariots, hoping to break the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander's men had trained for this. They simply opened gaps in their formation and let the chariots pass through harmlessly. Then the main engagement began. Alexander, as always, was on the right wing with his companion cavalry. He saw that the Persian line was stretching to overlap his flank. Instead of retreating, he moved further right, drawing more and more Persian cavalry away from the centre. A gap began to open in the Persian line. Alexander struck like lightning. He wheeled his cavalry and charged directly into the gap, heading straight for Darius. Once again, the Macedonian king cut his way toward the Persian king. Once again, the two monarchs came within sight of each other, and once again, Darius broke. He turned and fled, abandoning his army, his treasure, and his empire. The Persian centre collapsed. Though parts of the Persian army fought on bravely, the battle was decided. By nightfall, the Persian Empire was finished. In a single afternoon, Alexander had made himself master of the known world. The aftermath of Gaugamela was a whirlwind of conquest and treasure. Alexander marched unopposed into Babylon, the ancient and magnificent city on the Euphrates. The city surrendered without a fight. The Babylonians welcomed him as their new king. The treasury of Babylon contained an enormous fortune in silver and gold. From there, Alexander moved to Susa, one of the Persian capitals, where he seized another vast treasure. Finally, he arrived at Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. Here stood the magnificent palaces of the great kings, decorated with elaborate carvings showing conquered peoples bringing tribute. The treasury of Persepolis contained the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of empire. It reportedly took 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry it away. At Persepolis, Alexander revealed the destructive side of his nature. After a drunken banquet, he led his companions in burning the great palace to the ground. Some sources say it was a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. Others say it was a drunken impulse, perhaps encouraged by a Greek courtesan who reminded him of Persian atrocities. Whatever the reason, the destruction of Persepolis sent a message that the war of revenge was over. Alexander had achieved what Philip had dreamed of. He had made himself master of the Persian Empire. But he was not satisfied. There were still worlds to conquer. Darius was still alive, a fugitive in the eastern reaches of his former empire. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, driving his army at a pace that astonished the ancient world. His men marched hundreds of miles in a few weeks, giving the Persians no time to regroup. But Alexander never caught up with his rival. Before he could reach him, Darius was murdered by his own nobles. A group of Persian lords led by a man named Bessus stabbed their king and left him dying in a wagon. When Alexander found the body, he reportedly wept. He had wanted to defeat Darius in battle, not see him murdered by traitors. He gave his rival a royal funeral at Persepolis and declared himself the avenger of the fallen king. With Darius dead, Alexander was now the undisputed ruler of the Persian Empire. Many of his men expected to go home. They had achieved everything they had set out to do. The war was won. The enemy was destroyed. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams. But Alexander had no intention of stopping. He announced that he would pursue Bessus and the other regicides. Then he would continue east to the very edges of the world. His men were shocked, but they followed him. They always followed him. For the next 3 years, Alexander campaigned in the wild mountains and deserts of Central Asia. This was a very different kind of warfare from the set-piece battles against Darius. It was a brutal guerrilla war against fierce nomadic tribes who refused to submit. These years were the hardest of Alexander's career. His army marched through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. They crossed burning deserts and frozen mountain passes. They faced enemies who would melt away into the wilderness rather than face them in open battle, only to strike again without warning. Alexander was wounded several times. At one siege, an arrow pierced his lung. His doctors thought he would die. Instead, he recovered and led his men back into battle. He caught up with Bessus and had him executed in the Persian manner, his nose and ears cut off before he was killed. He founded more cities. He married a local princess named Roxana. And slowly, brutally, he forced the region into submission. But these hard years also revealed darker aspects of Alexander's character. He was drinking more heavily. He was becoming more paranoid, more suspicious of those around him. When his old friend Philotas was accused of plotting against him, Alexander had him tortured and executed. Then he ordered the murder of Philotas's father, the veteran general Parmenion, one of the most loyal and capable of his commanders. Another incident was even more shocking. At a drinking party, a man named Clytus saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. He became enraged when Alexander boasted of his divine parentage and denigrated his father Philip. In a drunken fury, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed his old friend with his own hands. When he sobered up, he was consumed with guilt and remorse. He refused to eat for days, but the deed was done and it cast a shadow over his reputation. In 327 BC, Alexander finally turned his attention to the furthest horizon of the known world. He led his army across the Hindu Kush mountains into India. The Greeks knew almost nothing about this land. It was a place of mystery and wonder, the edge of the world where the sun rose. Alexander claimed he was following in the footsteps of the gods Dionysus and Heracles, who had supposedly travelled there in the distant past. In reality, he was driven by an insatiable hunger for conquest and glory that could never be satisfied. The Indian campaign began with a series of victories over local kings. Then Alexander faced his most formidable Indian opponent, a king named Porus. Porus ruled a powerful kingdom on the far side of the Hydaspes River. He was a giant of a man, said to be over 6 feet tall, and he had a weapon that Alexander had never faced in battle before: war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of Alexander's greatest military achievements. The river was swollen with monsoon rains and seemed impossible to cross. Porus waited on the far bank with his army and his elephants. For days, Alexander feinted and manoeuvred, keeping the Indians guessing. Then, on a stormy night, he led part of his army on a secret crossing at a point far upstream. When dawn came, Alexander had his cavalry across the river and was charging toward the Indian army. The battle was fierce and bloody. The Indian elephants terrified the Macedonian horses and caused heavy casualties among the infantry. But the discipline and experience of Alexander's veterans eventually won out. The Indian army was encircled and destroyed. Porus himself, wounded in the battle, was brought before Alexander. When asked how he wanted to be treated, the Indian king replied simply, "As a king." Alexander was impressed. He restored Porus to his throne as a vassal and ally. After the Hydaspes, Alexander pressed on deeper into India, but his army was exhausted. They had been fighting and marching for 8 years. They were thousands of miles from home. The monsoon rain soaked them day and night. Strange diseases killed them by the hundreds. They faced unfamiliar enemies with terrifying weapons, and rumours reached them that beyond the next river, even mightier kingdoms waited with even more elephants. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, the army finally broke. The soldiers refused to go any further. Alexander pleaded with them, raged at them, and sulked in his tent for 3 days. But it was no use. For the first and only time in his life, Alexander was forced to turn back. The return journey was almost as dangerous as the campaign. Alexander led part of his army down the Indus River to the sea. He fought one desperate battle after another against the tribes along the banks. At the siege of one city, Alexander led the assault himself and jumped down from the walls into a crowd of enemies. He was hit by an arrow that pierced his lung. His bodyguards thought he was dead. By the time they broke through to him, he was barely breathing, his armour filled with blood. Against all odds, he survived, but he was never fully healthy again. When the army finally reached the coast, Alexander divided his forces. He sent his fleet, under the command of his admiral Nearchus, to explore the sea route back to Persia. He led the rest of his army on an overland march through the Gedrosian Desert. The march through the Gedrosian Desert was a catastrophe. It was one of the most hostile environments on Earth, a wasteland of burning sand and almost no water. Alexander had chosen this route partly because he wanted to outdo the great Persian kings who had lost armies in the same desert. But the cost was terrible. His army entered the desert with perhaps 30,000 soldiers. They emerged with perhaps 15,000. The rest died of thirst, starvation, and exhaustion. Whole units simply vanished into the sand. The survivors were walking skeletons, barely able to stagger forward. It was the worst disaster of Alexander's career, far more costly than any battle he had fought. When the survivors finally staggered back into civilization, they were met by the fleet under Nearchus, who had successfully explored the sea route. Alexander returned to Persia to find his empire in chaos. During his long absence, many of his appointed governors had grown corrupt and tyrannical, assuming he would never return from the ends of the earth. Alexander responded with a ruthless purge. Officials who had abused their power were executed. New administrators were appointed. The king showed that even after years away, his grip on his empire remained iron strong. He also took steps to bind his empire together. He arranged a mass wedding at the city of Susa, where he and 90 of his commanders married Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself took 2 new wives, both daughters of Persian kings. He was trying to create a new ruling class that blended Macedonian and Persian blood. These policies angered many of his Macedonian veterans. They had conquered the Persians, they did not want to share power with them. When Alexander dismissed some of his veteran soldiers and began recruiting Persians into his army, resentment boiled over into open mutiny. At the city of Opis, his own men refused his orders and told him to go fight with his new Persian soldiers instead. Alexander was furious. He had his bodyguard arrest the ringleaders and had them executed on the spot. Then he locked himself in his quarters and refused to see any of his Macedonians. He gave all the senior military positions to Persians. After several days, the Macedonians broke. They came to his door, weeping and begging forgiveness. Alexander emerged and embraced them. The mutiny was over, but it showed how deep the tensions in his empire had become. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon. He was planning new campaigns. He wanted to conquer Arabia. He talked of invading Carthage and Rome. Some even say he dreamed of marching all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. But fate had other plans. In early June, after a night of heavy drinking, Alexander fell ill with a fever. At first, it did not seem serious. He continued to plan his campaigns, meeting with his officers and making sacrifices to the gods. But the fever grew worse. Day by day, he grew weaker. His voice failed him. He could no longer speak to his men. His generals gathered around his bed, weeping. His soldiers, thousands of them, filed past to see him one last time. He was able to raise his hand in greeting to each one, but nothing more. On the evening of June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. He was just 32 years old. When his generals asked him to whom he left his empire, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." Whether this story is true or not, it perfectly captured the chaos that followed. With no clear heir and no designated successor, Alexander's generals immediately began fighting among themselves for control of his empire. Within a generation, the empire he had built was divided into several warring kingdoms. The age of the successors had begun, a blood-soaked era that would shape the ancient world for centuries. The cause of Alexander's death has been debated for over 2,000 years. Some ancient sources claimed he was poisoned by one of his generals. Others blamed his wounds, especially the arrow that had pierced his lung in India. Modern historians have suggested various diseases, including typhoid fever or possibly a hemorrhagic fever. Some have even proposed that he died from complications of his heavy drinking. We will probably never know for certain. What we do know is that his death came far too soon, at the height of his powers, with his ambition still unfulfilled. The empire Alexander built did not survive him, but his legacy transformed the ancient world. His conquests spread Greek culture across a vast area, from Egypt to India. This began the Hellenistic Age, a period when Greek language, philosophy and art flourished throughout the Near East. The cities he founded became centres of learning and commerce. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest city of the ancient world, home to the famous library that preserved the wisdom of the ancient world. Greek became the common language of educated people from Rome to India. When the New Testament was written centuries later, it was written in Greek, a direct result of Alexander's conquests. Alexander also changed the nature of kingship forever. Before him, Greek kings were leaders of city-states, first among equals. After him, kings were godlike rulers of vast empires, surrounded by elaborate court ceremonies borrowed from Persia. His successors and their descendants ruled the Hellenistic kingdoms for 3 centuries until they were finally absorbed by Rome. Even the Roman emperors looked back to Alexander as their model and inspiration. Julius Caesar wept when he saw a statue of Alexander, lamenting that at the same age he had achieved nothing comparable. The legend of Alexander lived on long after the facts of his life were forgotten. In the centuries after his death, his story was told and retold, growing more fantastic with each retelling. He became the hero of a wildly popular romance that was translated into dozens of languages. In this legendary version, Alexander visited the bottom of the sea in a glass diving bell. He flew through the sky in a basket carried by giant eagles. He found the fountain of youth and the gates that held back the monsters at the end of the world. From Iceland to Indonesia, people told stories of Iskander, or Alexander, or Dul Karnain, the 2-horned king who conquered the world. But behind all the legends was a man of flesh and blood, a brilliant and deeply flawed human being. Alexander was capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. He could be generous to defeated enemies or order the massacre of entire cities. He was a military genius who never lost a battle, but also a heavy drinker who murdered his friends in fits of rage. He dreamed of uniting East and West, but his methods were brutal conquest and mass killing. He freed some peoples and enslaved others. He built cities and burned palaces. He was, in short, a human being, with all the contradictions that implies. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Alexander was the scale of his ambition. He was not content to be king of Macedon, though that would have made him one of the most powerful men of his age. He was not content with the conquest of Persia, though that gave him the largest empire the world had ever seen. He wanted to reach the very edges of the earth, to go where no man had gone before, to achieve a glory that would live forever. In this at least he succeeded. His name is still synonymous with greatness more than 2,000 years after his death. To walk through the ruins of the ancient world today is to follow in Alexander's footsteps. You can visit the site of his victory at Gaugamela in Iraq. You can stand at the tomb of his ancestor Achilles at Troy in Turkey. You can explore the great city of Alexandria that still bears his name in Egypt. From the archaeological museums of Greece to the forgotten battlefields of Central Asia, the traces of his passage endure. He was a force of nature, a hurricane in human form who swept across the ancient world and left nothing unchanged. The death of Alexander was not just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. Within hours of his final breath, his empire began to splinter. His generals, the men who had followed him across the world, immediately began plotting against each other. His body, preserved in honey, became a prize to be fought over. Ptolemy, who had been one of his closest companions, eventually seized it and brought it to Alexandria in Egypt. There it was placed in a magnificent tomb of gold and glass, where visitors could gaze upon the face of the conqueror for centuries to come. The tomb became one of the most famous monuments of the ancient world. Julius Caesar himself visited it and wept at the sight. Augustus came too, though he accidentally broke off Alexander's nose while paying his respects. But sometime in the chaos of late antiquity, the tomb was lost. To this day, archaeologists search for it beneath the modern streets of Alexandria. The kingdoms that Alexander's generals carved out of his empire would shape the world for 300 years. Ptolemy and his descendants ruled Egypt until Cleopatra, the last of his line, lost her kingdom to Rome. Seleucus and his heirs controlled a vast realm stretching from Syria to Iran. Antigonus and his family fought for control of Macedon and Greece. These successor kingdoms kept Greek culture alive across the ancient Near East. They built great libraries and patronized philosophers and scientists. It was in the Ptolemaic Alexandria that scholars calculated the circumference of the earth and catalogued the stars. It was in the Seleucid kingdom that Greek ideas mixed with Persian and Indian traditions to create new forms of art and thought. But the wars of Alexander's successors were also brutal and seemingly endless. For 50 years after his death, his former generals and their sons fought each other in a series of devastating conflicts. Entire populations were displaced. Ancient cities were destroyed and rebuilt. The borders of kingdoms shifted with each new battle. It was a world of constant warfare where kings rose and fell with alarming speed. The dream of a unified empire died with Alexander. In its place arose a system of competing great powers that would last until Rome swallowed them all. The memory of Alexander cast a long shadow over all the kings who came after him. Every ruler of the Hellenistic age measured himself against the conqueror. They adopted his imagery, his titles, and his style of warfare. They named their sons Alexander in hopes that some of his glory might transfer to them, but none of them could match his achievements. He remained the standard against which all military greatness was measured. When Roman generals like Pompey and Caesar sought the highest praise, they were called the new Alexander. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he claimed to be following in Alexander's footsteps. The conqueror's influence reached far beyond the ancient world. Alexander's story also became a vehicle for exploring deep questions about human nature and the limits of power. Ancient philosophers debated whether he was a great man or a great villain. Was he a visionary who sought to unite humanity, or a bloodthirsty conqueror driven by insatiable ego? The answer, as with most great historical figures, is that he was both. He brought Greek civilization to millions of people who had never known it. He also killed hundreds of thousands of people who simply wanted to be left alone. He dreamed of a world where Greeks and Persians would live as equals. He also demanded to be worshipped as a god and murdered those who questioned him. The philosophical schools of the ancient world found different lessons in his story. The Stoics saw him as an example of how great gifts could be corrupted by unchecked passion. The Cynics mocked his ambition, pointing out that in the end, he possessed no more earth than was needed to bury him. The later tradition of Alexander romance transformed him into a seeker of wisdom, who travelled to the ends of the earth to find the secrets of the universe. Each age found in Alexander what it was looking for. Even in distant lands that Alexander never reached, his legend took root. In Jewish and Islamic tradition, he appears as a righteous king who built a wall to keep out the savage tribes of Gog and Magog. In Persian poetry, despite the destruction he wrought on their ancient empire, he became Iskander, a hero who sought the water of life. In medieval European romances, he visited underwater kingdoms and journeyed to the gates of paradise. The historical Alexander, the flesh and blood man who conquered the world, disappeared behind layer upon layer of legend. But perhaps that is fitting. Alexander always saw himself as more than mortal. In death, he achieved the immortality he had sought in life. In the end, Alexander's greatest legacy is perhaps his story itself. It is a story of ambition and achievement on a scale that seems almost superhuman. It is the story of a young man who refused to accept any limit, who kept reaching for the horizon no matter how many times he conquered it. It is a story that has inspired generals and dreamers, tyrants and liberators for more than 2,000 years. The boy king from the mountains of Macedon became something more than human in the imagination of the world. He became a symbol of what one determined person can achieve. The Lion of Macedon no longer conquers cities, but the legend of Alexander the Great, the young king who conquered the world, continues to burn as brightly as ever across the ages.